Alright, so what we're looking at going over in this chapter is cleaning up our modeling. So up to this point, all the modeling that we've done has just been to get it to look good visually. But now we need to pay attention to some technical things as well. It's really important that you do your modeling in such a way that things like vertex painting and lighting will work with how you've modeled it. So to illustrate that, what we're going to do is create a new vertex bake set. You can see that that's grayed out for me here. So if we go to the show panel and turn off polygons, the reason that happened is when I selected the scene, or just kind of marquee selected everything, there was a few curves there. So now that I've deleted those curves, I can go ahead and select all my geometry and create a new vertex bake set. So what I'm going to show you how to do in this chapter is how to take your geometry and bake ambient occlusion to the vertices. And by doing so, it will show you where you need to maybe add some more polygons or clean things up. So to do this, I'm right-clicking on the roof, going down to the Baking tab, and I'm assigning a new bake set to the vertices. Now looking at the attribute editor here, we can see we have a bunch of different options. First is what kind of thing we want to bake to the vertices. We can do light and color, only light. We're going to choose occlusion, and we're going to give this a new name just so it's easy to find. So let's call this AO initial. But you can call it whatever you like. I'm just naming it something that I will be able to recognize when we look for it in the hypershade later. So now I'm right-clicking to get on the roof and going to the color set editor. And right now you see we have no color sets assigned to this roof. And so in order to do that, what I have to do is open up my hypershade. So we'll go over here to the left and activate the hypershade window. And then we're going to go up and tab across the top here till we get to bake sets. And there you can see the AO underscore initial bake set that we created. But before I go and assign this bake set to my geometry, I'm just going to create a new color set name. And I'm just going to name it an abbreviation of what I named the bake set. Now I want to show you some functionality of things you can do in the hypershade. For example, if I right click, I can select all the objects that this bake set is assigned to. I can also right click and frame those objects just in case I want to see really quickly in my scene which objects have the bake set assigned to them. We can also assign the bake set to selected geometry, which I just did just to give all this the same bake set. Now you can see if I right click and select it, they all become highlighted. So don't forget that the hypershade can also be a very powerful tool for scene management. And so the next thing I'm going to do here is go up to the lighting and shading tab and go to the batch bake. So what we're going to do is use mental ray to bake our ambient occlusion right now. And let's make sure that the objects to bake is at selected. And we want to bake to vertices. I want to show you that you could also bake to textures in case you want to do something like a light map or an ambient occlusion map. You can do that also. But we want to keep everything just to vertices right now because that will show us where we went wrong in the modeling phase and what we need to clean up. So now that we have our bake set assigned to this geometry, let's go ahead and bake it by clicking Convert and Close in the Mental Ray baking options. And after a few seconds, here we have our ambient occlusion bake. And as you can see, this is, for the most part, a disaster. Some objects are completely black. Other pieces are just covered in just an even gray tone. What we want to see is the majority of this model still being white, but the corners having darkness in them. You may have noticed that another thing that happened was I got an error when I baked the geometry, saying that there was a piece of geometry that had no faces assigned to it. So what I've done is opened up the outliner and typed in a portion of its name. And now I'm clicking on the objects to find the one that had no faces assigned to it, which was lofted surface 62. You can see that there's no verts, edges, or faces on this object. And I'm just going to delete that so I don't get that error in the future. So the next thing I want to show you is now when I select my geometry, in the color set editor, you can see our color set editor name that we typed in earlier shows up. And this is so we can manage multiple color sets. Because this is just a color set for ambient occlusion. You may have other color sets for direct light, indirect light, things like that. So in a nutshell, the color set editor is one of the ways in Maya you can manage your lighting sets. And it works as simply as just selecting which color set you want to bake and then baking it. That's why it's important to name things in a way that you'll know what's what. So getting back to the geometry here and looking at some of the errors we're getting. Some of these objects are black. Some of them are just even gray. And like I said earlier, the look we want with ambient occlusion is most of this object to be white. but in the cracks and crevices and corners we want darkness. And that's why I'm using ambient occlusion to test out my geometry. It does the best job at showing us where there's errors, where we need to add more polygons, and where we need to clean stuff up. So let's go ahead and do the same thing we just did to the left side of this scene and apply it to the right side here as well. So I'm just going to select all that geometry, and we'll go ahead and assign this AO initial bake set to these pieces. Go ahead and turn off the hypershade. And then I'm going to go up to the lighting shading tab and bake it. Now while we're waiting for this to bake, there's an important point I want to make, and that is what I'm showing you in this chapter might not apply to all game engines. For example, if you have a game engine where everything is dynamic and you're using screen space ambient occlusion or things like that, there might not be a need to clean up the geometry in this way. It might actually just be a waste of time and add polygons. But if you are on a game engine where you're doing any kind of baking to vertices for ambient occlusion, direct light, this totally applies. So really, it's important that you look at the technology you're working on and see how important vertex cleanliness is. Again, if you need it for any kind of lighting, vertex painting, then everything I'm going to show you in this chapter is a good rule of thumb. So what I'm doing right now actually is duplicating the bad versions, the versions before I clean this up, just so I can compare at the end. And so you'll be able to see, kind of the before and after. And I'm just going to put them in their own layer and then turn the layer off so that they're in the scene but out of sight for now. So to get started here on cleaning this up, we're going to start with one of the worst examples, a piece that's totally black. And the reason this piece is totally black is because all the verts are hidden. And this is problematic because since the verts are hidden, when we bake lighting information to the verts, it thinks that the whole piece is hidden, therefore making it black. So the solution to this problem is obviously to unhide the verts. And so what I'm doing is just snapping them to the piece that they're sitting against so that they're no longer hidden behind that piece. And now as we bake it, you can see that it's much improved. And although it could look better, it's no longer totally black. So moving on to the next problem are these pieces that are even gray. And the reason this is happening is because we don't have enough subdivisions. So just adding a slice in here, you can see that it improved it slightly. But remember that the look we want is most of this to be white with just darkness in the corners. So something that might be a problem is our actual bake settings. So what I'm doing right now is I'm changing the occlusion fall off. And what this should do is, now that I have a subdivision in here, should concentrate more of the darkness to just the corners. And you can see that it did that. And now if we add even more subdivisions and bake it again, now we're getting more of the desired result. So this is kind of the game that we have to play right now to clean this geometry up and make sure that it will work for a variety of circumstances, whether it be vertex painting or lighting or whatever. The point is we don't want to have any verts that are hidden because they'll just end up being black. We want to make sure that things are sewn together, stitched nicely, and we have a certain amount of resolution, meaning subdivisions and stuff, so that we can get the kind of ambient occlusion we want. But at the same time, we don't want to add so many vertices that this becomes difficult to run at a frame rate that we need. It really is a quality versus performance kind of an issue. If I was to make this whole thing 1,000,000 polygons and stitch it together perfectly, we would get a perfect AO bake, but then again it wouldn't run. So in some areas it won't be perfect, but we got to make sure that it's good enough that we don't have the obvious errors, and then it looks as good as it can. And from my experience in game development, this is one of those things that, for the most part, kind of gets put on the back burner, gets ignored. It's one of those things that's so important to the look of a scene, and yet a lot of times it never happens. And people wonder why, their scene doesn't light good or doesn't paint well. And the reason is your geometry might be messy and slammed, might not be put together right. Who knows, you may be looking at this chapter thinking, oh, this does not look fun. But at the end of the day, this is one of those things that really matters. If you wonder why some games look better than others, it's this kind of attention to detail that does it. And if you're working in a game engine that's editor-based, meaning you might just be making props, and then they go into an editor, and then they're kind of just slammed together and can't really follow these rules, keep in mind that you can still follow this kind of cleanliness to the individual assets, and they'll look that much better. So what I'm doing right now to get back to what's going on currently in the scene is I'm just kind of trimming the geometry out, sewing it together, and then after I do that, I go ahead and rebake it to make sure that all the areas that are black just disappear. So right now I'm using the split polygon tool, holding down V to kind of trim out this piece to the one next to it, and then deleting those faces. And then we'll go and we'll relight this. You can see it's improving. We'll go ahead and do the same thing to this piece down here. Again, using the split polygon tool, holding down V to snap to these edges, and then deleting the faces we don't want, just so the whole thing is stitched together. And you can see that it's lighting much better now. Those areas that were black now are shaded correctly. Right here we have some edges that are hidden. It's just a matter of pulling them out against that building. Sometimes it can get a little bit more complicated. Down here we're going to have to do a little bit more modeling to get this stitched in nicely with the other wall. But as we light it, we're getting a much better result now. And this is really the technique. It's not rocket science. It's just pretty tedious. To do this to a whole scene can take quite a bit of time. But like I said earlier, if you wonder why some games look really good, it's this kind of love and attention. So I'm just kind of pulling some points. Now sewed that together. So another thing I should mention is that as I'm kind of stitching these pieces together, I'm creating a lot of 5- and 6-sided polygons. Eventually I have to go in and clean those up as well so that they'll light better. But I'm not really worrying about that right now, just because I can do that when I'm all done using Maya's cleanup tool. So comparing these two together, you can see on the left-hand side near the smokestack area, where I was getting that really poor ambient occlusion before, I fixed a lot of that now by stitching this thing together and cleaning up the verts. Alright, so something else that's very important to note along the lines of cleaning up our geometry is not only should things be stitched together decently, but they should also have a minimum level of subdivisions. So you can see right now on this ground piece, I'm adding a cut every 2 units. And that's just kind of a good minimum to have. You can see I'm adding that to the bottom edges there as well. And we'll go ahead and do that to this wall too, using the Cut Faces tool. And by coming up with some kind of a minimum, whether it's every 1 unit or 2 units or 4 units, you'll find that you'll get a much more even vertex bake. Which you'll notice as I light this piece now, you can see it's much cleaner. And so in a nutshell, that's pretty much the technique. If you watch the time lapse here, you'll see me stitching pieces together. You'll also see me adding, using the Cut Faces tool, kind of a minimum amount of subdivision, which I'm doing right now. Again, making sure I have a slice every, 2 units for this scene. And then I go in and I rebake, just make sure that I get a decent result. And if I don't, I go and I stitch the geometry a little bit better, like I'm doing right now, just to improve that result. It's not rocket science, it's more just kind of hard manual labor. Might be the equivalent of mining for coal in the game development world. But you can see the scene is dramatically improving as I stitch this thing together. And just to reiterate what I said earlier about, not every game engine needing this kind of detail. I've worked on scenes before that were entirely dynamic, meaning we're using screen space ambient occlusion instead of baking it to the verts. It was done programmatically. And all the lighting might be using dynamic lights, or you might have a deferred renderer. And in that case, this might be excessive. But from what I've seen in the industry, the majority of game companies at this point are still using some kind of vertex baking. In the future, it'll probably be less, but for now, these are good rules to follow. As far as the tools that I'm using to do this, it's mostly the split polygon tool and the cut faces tool. You might be wondering why I'm not using any kind of booleans, and that's pretty much just because in Maya they're horrible. I would love to actually use them, but you'll find if you have two pieces and you try and boolean them together that for the most part it either fails or one of the pieces disappears, vanishes. Hopefully it's something they fix in the future, but for now, just doing it the good old manual way, using the cut faces tool and the split polygon tool. Another good thing that can come out of this kind of cleanup is as we go through and light them, or in this case we're just kind of pre-lighting them just to see how they'll work, it'll expose a lot of faces that might be flipped or corrupted, stuff like that. You might also find normals that have gone crazy and need to be unlocked. And even though this is pretty much a very tedious thing to do, it will have the beneficial effect of kind of testing out your artwork and finding a bunch of errors that are better found now than later. That being said, I usually don't go to this level of detail where I'm stitching the whole scene together until I know for a fact that nothing in the scene is going to be changed. For example, I wouldn't do this too early on where maybe the level that I'm working on hasn't been tested, because if they make a change, you've done all this work, then it's work for nothing. So you want to kind of put this at the more polished phase of things. Doing it too early can just be a waste. But you want to make sure you get to it at some point if this is the kind of thing that your game engine will benefit from. And so getting back to the present here, I'm still following the same pattern, using the split polygon tool to trim edges out, just kind of sewing everything together, deleting faces that I don't need, which in a lot of ways will affect performance in a good way. We'll have less fill, there'll be less polygons sitting behind other polygons. And the goal is just to get this thing to be as airtight as possible. Another side effect of this kind of cleanup is that we'll get rid of a lot of faces that aren't even visible. You don't want to be carrying around faces that give you nothing. For example, if I have a wall inside of another wall and it's just sitting in there, it's probably affecting performance because I have, two polygons layered up inside each other. And you're just wasting memory as well, carrying around faces that you don't see. No matter what system we're developing for, keep in mind that there's a limited number of resources. There's only so much memory, and every wasteful piece you have in a scene is just eating up space that you could be putting something else in. So like I was saying earlier, cleaning stuff up like this, while sometimes it seems like you're adding a bunch of polygons, you'll probably find that during the cleanup, you actually end up with less polygons than you started. For example, you might have noticed I just chopped the back half of two pillars that were just embedded in the wall there. And so half of the geometry for those pillars was totally wasteful. It was just sitting behind the wall. And so cleaning that up, might have saved me 400, 500 polygons right there for no visual difference and an increase in performance. So at this point I feel that it's pretty clear why I'm doing this and how I'm doing this. So I'll spare you the time lapse of me doing the whole other right-hand building as well. But just to simplify everything, we could probably sum this all up with a few rules. And those are, if you're using an engine that needs any kind of vertex baking or vertex painting, make sure you have a minimum amount of subdivision in your geometry so that things will light well and paint well. Also make sure that you're stitching things together where it makes sense so that you're not hiding any polygons. And while this is just a trick that I kind of use, I find that baking ambient occlusion to the verts is a good way to test them out. It's just an easy way to find out what needs to be fixed. And once you've fixed it, an easy way to test it out. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to kind of skip ahead a little bit right now, just so we can see the before and after, so you can see what the results of this kind of cleanup are. At this point, it's probably a little redundant to keep watching the time lapse of me stitching everything together, and I still have the whole other building. So I just want to compare kind of a before and after. The one on the right is where we started. You can see a lot of pieces are black. A lot of the subdivisions in the geometry are very uneven. Whereas the new one on the left is much cleaner. No verts are being hidden. Nothing's totally black. And if I need to light it or do any vertex painting to it, I know that I'll get a good result because everything's been cleaned up.